First of all, I want to thank those of you who have chosen to spend time with us this afternoon on this important topic. As I said, we have more than 1,000 team members that registered to participate in this conversation today. And we're all coming this afternoon with our own thoughts and reflections and personal histories. So whatever moved you to join the conversation today, I just want to thank you first for your participation. We are here because we need to have an open and honest conversation about racism and racial inequality. And I'll share my thoughts as I join today after the devastating events of the last days and weeks. I've been doing a lot of soul searching, and you probably have too. And at times it's been painful. Emotions have been very close to the surface, and I have found it hard at times to put into words what I'm feeling. But I finally have acknowledged two things. One is I am a white female of privilege, and that means that I cannot stay silent on this issue. I need to act. And the great thing, the second thing that I have acknowledged is that I lead an amazing organization that's made up of 4,000 people, people of courage, people of integrity, and that if we come together to listen and to understand, we can take very meaningful action. We can impact not only within our four walls of our workplace, but the work that we can do can spill over into our communities. I do think that we've done really good work on inclusion so far. I think we have a strong culture, and I think we have the courage to face the brutal facts. That is consistent with our core values. But I also want to acknowledge today that we're a very cautious organization as well, and we're very planful. And I think it's time in our discussions on inclusion to push further, to increase the candor in our discussions and to make real change, which is why we wanted to start today. So before we get started, I want to say to our Black colleagues on the phone, we see you, I see you. We understand this is not a situation that just sprung up over the weekend. This is a reality of injustice and racism that has existed for centuries. And I want to commit to you today, and I speak for the whole HNA EMT, that we will use all the platforms and resources that we have to help the Black and the Brown employees of Hilti, but also communities overcome these challenges. That's what building a better future is going to mean for us in some dimension. So why are we here today, and what is this today that we're doing? In the EMT for some time, we have been working on a concept where we could share topics, where we could have an open space for discussion, completely non-structural, non-hierarchical, disconnected from our org charts, but a space where we could bring the ideas and the concerns of our whole community together in a forum that was safe, that was open for everyone, where we could share and we could make change. And the events of last weekend did spur us then to finally pull this topic forward, pull this format forward, and start today with the first of the team talks. So I'm so glad that we had this approach kind of almost developed so that we could not waste any time to get started. And this is only the beginning of a conversation. We're not going to solve anything today, but I hope that this sets the tone for how we approach going forward. We want to hear from you. We're going to need to listen to each other for us to make meaningful progress and to understand the direction that we should be going. So again, I just want to thank you for the courage that you showed to join today. And I want to hand it over to Alison Braman, our VP of HR. Alison.
Thanks, Martina. Really super opening. I really appreciate it. Also want to welcome everyone today. I'm super inspired, very hopeful, seeing how many folks have dialed in. And just want to say everyone dialing in obviously has a very personal story, a really individual lens in which they are experiencing, reacting to the state of our country. So I don't take for granted. Today's going to mean very different things for different people, but at the root of it, your attendance, it shows interest and not indifference, which for me is really a real key starting point to having a good discussion and seeking to understand. So I joined the conversation today. I'm honored to host. I'm committed personally, I'm committed professionally to more urgent, more proactive actions, both for a better society, but also for a stronger workplace. So I'd be remiss if I also didn't acknowledge my lens as a white female of privilege co-facilitating a conversation on racism and racial inequality. But I'm pleased to be doing so, and it's important to me that really all hands have to be in this fight in order to make change. So like everybody on the call, I'm changed by the recent events that we're all witnessing. You know, there's protests, not just in our nation, but actually across the globe. We're seeing images across the globe around several violent deaths of Black people in recent weeks. George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. I mean, there's names that go on and on, most names not ever making their way to social media. So this isn't a recent events topic, but it is recently obviously getting attention that's long overdue. So today, you know, we're really here to listen and learn more about the experiences of our Black and Brown communities, in hopes that we could also better understand a bit how our colleagues of color are also feeling and what they need from us now and how we can collectively help. So as Martina mentioned, this isn't a once and done conversation. I see this very much as a starting point on this topic in particular, and appreciate everybody's attendance. So with that, I'm really honored actually to welcome Shani Barrax Moore. She's going to join me today and really help to lead the conversation. Shani is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the University of North Texas. She's a strategic diversity and inclusion practitioner, over 20 years of experience in training and development, strategic planning, change management, programming, recruitment, tons of really great experience. So we're really lucky to have you here for today's session. On behalf of the entire Hilti North American team, a warm welcome. And thank you very much for joining us on super short notice and for being a part of our first inaugural team talk session. So with that, a welcome, and I'd like us to jump in and get started. And just sort of a framing comment, we'll spend a few minutes together, probably the next 20 or 25 minutes talking through various topics, and then we have definitely left space at the end for questions. We had lots of questions already pre-submitted, so thank you very much. But we'd like you to actively use the chat throughout the session as well. And we clearly won't get to all of the questions, but we'll actively, as we do with all of our other forums, gather the questions and react to them after the session. So with that, again, pleased to welcome you, Shani, and would like to really just start out by saying, how are you doing, and why did you choose to join us today?
Sure. Well, I want to thank you again for having me, and thank you to Sylvia Sequeira for inviting me to do this. It's been a pleasure getting to know her and getting to know Hilti through her. So I'm just really honored that you all have asked me to be here with you today. And I also appreciate you asking me how I'm doing. You know, this has been a excruciatingly difficult time for particularly Black African-American folks. And, you know, the reason that I chose to share this slide, this is a picture of my daughters. My daughter Kayla is 14, my daughter Andrea is 13. And, you know, I'm feeling somewhere between incapacitated, numb, and enraged. You know, I can understand some of the rage that is being expressed throughout the country right now. The last week has been spent having conversations with my children, a lot of tears, a lot of, Mommy, I don't understand why, just because our skin's a little bit darker, you know, that we're going to be treated differently. And primarily they're worried about their father and their brother. You know, we their father and I are no longer married, but when we lived in Capel, he got pulled over and racially profiled so many times, I can't even count, with our children in the car. And there was even one situation, I'd call it a show me your paper situation, where he was warming up the car for the kids to go to school. And there was a police officer who said that there had been a burglary and that he didn't believe he lived there, and followed him into the house. And it wasn't until our children burst into tears that he realized what he had done. So this is something that is very near and dear to not only myself, but many other Black families. And I think for my kids in particular, they're girls, and they know that they're not exempt, because Sandra Bland was my sorority sister. She was a member of Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated. And so we are not, just because we're still in Black bodies, and just because we're not Black males does not mean that we are not. I'm just as terrified of the police, quite frankly, as probably not as much as Black males are, and as their father and their brother are. But the reason that I chose to be here is, I watched. I know many of you may have watched the press conference that was held the other day, where President Trump stood in front of that church with the Bible. And I was raised Episcopalian. So he was in front of an Episcopal church. And that bishop said, what we need to do is be agents of healing, agents of change and agents of healing. So that's really why I've chosen to be here today. I am blessed that I live this work as a social justice warrior, if you will. I'm a self-proclaimed social justice warrior, but as a diversity and inclusion practitioner, I'm blessed that this is the work that I'm actually paid to do, and it aligns with the life that I live. And so, when I was asked to share kind of what my motto is, you see what's there on the screen. It's a favorite quote of mine from Frederick Douglass: without struggle, there's no progress. Power concedes nothing without demand. And I just want to commend Hilti for doing this, because you're acknowledging that there's a struggle, but you're trying to make progress through starting with dialogue. And so that's really why I'm here. I just want to be part of that process. I see this almost as a ministry for me. And I'm a purveyor of cultural humility, which we'll talk about in a little while. So thanks again for having me.
Super. Thank you for being so open and just your transparency to get the discussion going. I know a lot of your experiences that you're sharing resonate with many people on the call, and maybe for others, they don't have any connection to that at all. And that's a part of why we need to have this conversation. So I really appreciate you being so open to begin with. So let's kind of dig in a little bit more. I think it's probably an important place to set a little bit the stage. Again, we're not talking about just recent events. We're talking about really a systemic racism issue that we have specifically in this country. And so we really need to be able to acknowledge that there is a problem. And so I think it would be great if you can sort of talk to us a little bit more about some of the history that exists, not just in the extreme history, but even our current state of things. I think would be a great place to begin.
Sure. So, most of us have probably heard of, and if you haven't, I'm sharing it with you, the New York Times podcast series 1619. That is the year that the first enslaved African was brought to Jamestown. And it really focuses on the way in which Black bodies have built this country, and the way that enslaved Africans, were taken from all that they knew, brought into this new place and space, and we're just told to leave behind everything that you have and that you are, for this new world. And so I would encourage everybody to listen to that New York Times podcast. I was thinking about this earlier, Alison, and it may be triggering for some people because I haven't even made it all the way through yet, because it's just very difficult for me to to really digest the fact that this is how we all got here, right? Was through the brutality of slavery. And I think a lot of what it talks about too is there still exist these psychological effects of slavery, not just for people of color, but also for white people, for the majority of people who were just as much part of that system of enslavement, if not more so, right? That system of enslavement. So I just want to make it clear for folks who say, oh, slavery happened, however long ago. Slavery's still happening. It's just called a different name. And so I want to start with that, that image that is over that book, The New Jim Crow. Some people may have heard of the term Jim Crow. It's not a real person. However, it was started through minstrelsy and blackface at the turn of the century. And, my mother was Caribbean, and there's one thing that my mother said to me when I was very, very young that stuck with me. The negative stereotypes about Black Americans are exported all over the world. And that really stuck with me because when you think about it, Jim Crow was this fictional character that you see there on the right, that was meant to caricaturize Black people as buffoons, as lazy, as stupid, as all of those negative things so that it is easier to treat them as less than, right? And so Jim Crow came to be known as that system of oppression of our own American-grown apartheid, if you will, that still, even though African Americans and Black folks, and I'm saying African Americans in this setting because these are people who were obviously citizens of the United States, albeit at 3/5 of a person, who were part of the system of Jim Crow, of the separate water fountains and everything that we know as it relates to the way our history was up until recently. But I think the other thing to point out is that, and this is the image below that, there's a new Jim Crow system that is, in effect, our prison industrial system. And Michelle Alexander wrote this seminal book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And I just want to make a point here that, those of us who may be Gen Xers like myself, and maybe boomers and older may have been raised to say, I don't see color. But the reality is, if we don't begin seeing the differences between us, you can't affirm differences if you pretend that they don't exist, right? And so what she's talking about in this book is this new Jim Crow, which is the school to prison pipeline. Because as you see in the graphic that explains the school to prison pipeline here, Black children are disciplined at much higher rates than any other group. And because of our privatized prison industrial complex, it is in law enforcement's best interest to get people into those prisons. And so that's quite frankly why we're seeing what we're seeing now, is that we're seeing this systemic racism and oppression at play, and it's really come to a head. So if we go to the next slide, one of the things I like to share about any ism, and we're talking about racism here, for any ism, the formula, if you will, is power plus privilege equals whatever the ism is. So here we're talking about racial power, which would be in effect all those who are white and who are not people of color, plus the privilege that comes with that power equals racism. And they're different kinds, and this goes for homophobia, this goes for sexism. You can always count on that equation, if you will, being the formula for racism. And there are a couple of different kinds of racism. There's that individual racism that's interpersonal, that's person to person, that results from our own prejudice and biases, and that we don't realize that that individual racism leads to institutional racism, because the reality is we all work in institutions. I'm in the institution of higher education. You're in the institution of corporate America. There are institutions, obviously the criminal justice system is an institution. Even when you break down education, there's K-12 and then higher education. all of that is an institution where our personal individual racism can have an impact on the policies, programs, and practices and other people within those institutions. And then structural racism is, quite frankly, what slavery was built upon, are the structures that are in place now, all of the cumulative history. And I think it's really important for us to remember the word here is cumulative, that this has been going on since my ancestors were brought over in a boat. And we are still continuing to treat people of color as 3/5 of a human being. You can look at what happened at the border with our Latinx brothers and sisters, with people being caged as if they are not human. So it's taking the humanity out of our fellow humans is what really contributes to the structural racism, which is our current reality across institutions. And that's, really when we say, if you want to change the system, you have to start with yourself and acknowledge that you may be perpetuating some personal racism. You have to think about how might that be showing up in the respective institutions where I am, and not only where I move through, but the people who are closest to me move through. As you can imagine, I'm a bit of a mama bear when it comes to my children, and being aware of those systems that are even tangentially related to you. And then we have to, what I am hoping is that everything that's happening in our country right now will show that we have got to begin to dismantle the structural racism that is causing so much of the unrest that people have just had enough of. And so I'm keeping my fingers crossed that that will in fact be the outcomes of what's happening in our country now. Yeah.
Thanks for taking time to sort of walk back a bit, because I think that cumulative piece that you're describing is clearly something that I think isn't always on the front minds of those that aren't experiencing that every day. And so I think, part of today's session is really about, internalizing this and doing personal reflections, like you said, is really where it must begin. And I think to disregard the buildup to where we are today is missing it all. And it I think then puts in better context when you start to reflect on what is actually happening today, and maybe a bit of how we have gotten here today. And so to switch gears a little bit, could you share with me your perspective? Why do you think the George Floyd death has turned into sort of this tipping point? What's your perspective on that?
Sure. So I think going back to that notion of it being cumulative, I think is really important. And for me, from my perspective, it comes down to identity development. And this next slide kind of shares with us what identity development is. So I'm going to give you the academic definition, and then I'm going to give you the lay person's terms definition. So the academic definition is a person's awareness and understanding of oppression, and I'll talk a little bit about oppression in a minute, within the social environment externally, but also within every person. Because I don't know if you all talk about socialization when you have your bias conversations, but when you wake up every day, you are part of a system of oppression. All of us are on opposite sides of internalized subordination or internalized domination. And so this is part of people's developmental process, where they're looking around and seeing that they're either a have or a have not, right? That they have that internalized domination of believing that white people should be here and everybody else should be here. And then for everybody else who's here, that results in that internalized subordination that that's just the way it is. That's where it's supposed to be. And that's part of a developmental process that we'll talk about in a little bit. But notice what I have here highlighted. Describes the differences in the way individuals incorporate, resist, or redefine specific manifestations of social oppression, and is applicable to various social groups. So gender, race, religion, age, ability, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, all of those have identity development. What it really is how do you see yourself in the social context and construct of where it is you are existing. And so with that being said, I think it's that incorporate, resist. Unfortunately, you know, my daughters watched that George Floyd video. I have not, because I cannot watch another video like that. And my daughters are traumatized. So I would say to any other parents that may be in the call, if your kids have not seen the video, don't let them. Because, you know, if me at 45 is potentially traumatized, you know, I'm still undoing that within my daughters. And unfortunately, now that's become part of their awareness and understanding of oppression and the social environment that they're in, right? And it's affecting the way they see themselves and whether it should be okay for them to get called the N-word at school, because that is something I deal with as a mom, of having my children being called the N-word. It still happens in 2020, you know, so it affects how you see yourself. But if you want to take it a little further, and this next slide, I apologize for its busyness. This is what we often use when we are explaining there are identity development models. There are a number of different racial identity development models. There's one for Black African American, there's one for white, there's one for Latinx, there's one for Asian, there's one for multiracial, there's one for Native American Two-Spirits. What we do is we use this Hardeman-Jackson model to kind of show what everybody is going through simultaneously. And to answer your question, I think what is happening, you know, I'm not going to go through all of this, but passive acceptance and active acceptance is in effect where people of color are and white people are based upon the way that we've been socialized. And the way this model is set up, on one side, it's got, you know, we have for dominant, D is dominant social group, and F is subordinate social group. So again, it takes it back to that whole notion of internalized oppression. So identity development, people can be going through this model, and each of these boxes are stages. And what you see in between each of the boxes is a transition from one stage to the next, right? So we're a blank slate until society tells us who the goods and bads are, the haves or have-nots are, who you should bring home and who you shouldn't, right? Acceptance for people of color and for white people, and this is both active and passive acceptance, is the only place we'll ever get to without a choice, without any action. That is just the result of our socialization. That line below active and passive acceptance suggests that that is an intentional act to decide to move beyond just acceptance of the status quo into either active or passive resistance. So to answer your question, Alison, I think what's happening both for white folks and folks of color is that they've moved from passive resistance, knowing this stuff was happening, seeing, you know, we're constantly saying, say his name, say her name. We're tired of saying names. So we've gone, everybody, from passive resistance of anger and guilt, realizing, oh, this is bad, you know, oh, I'm going to start using my voice, to active resistance, where you're calling out oppression. So for the dominant social group, it's ownership of privilege. You know, you have to own your privilege first before you can get to active acceptance. Personal responsibility. And what I have found to be most heartening about all of these protests is the number of white people that I see out there, because they have now begun to own their privilege, and they are now in active resistance of calling out, of taking personal responsibility with folks of color who are the subordinate group when we're talking about internalized oppression, calling out oppression, feelings of anger, pain, anti-dominant feelings, loss of benefits. They're angry. That basically describes what's happening right now. You know, it's a perfect example of what active resistance, as you're going through this identity development process, looks like. And I think what's happening with these coalitions that are being built is that we're trying to, if you notice that space between active resistance and redefinition, where it's a new social identity, reconciling a positive and negative self-view, ending the collusion, cleansing that internalized subordination. That is often difficult to do on your own. That's often, I personally think, where multicultural counseling came into play, right? Because you have people who are trying to figure out, well, I see myself this way, but I go to work or I go to school, and the messages that my parents and my community has given me about Black being beautiful, Black being good, you know, or La Raza, for example, I'm not getting those messages affirmed when I walk out of my house. So I think what's happening now is, as that new social identity is being created, I think we as a country are trying to get to redefinition, where we're trying to redefine all that we have become since 1619. The cumulative effect of being 3/5 of a human, of Jim Crow. I would argue that Black men are still seen as 3/5 of a human. And I think they're using that active resistance, because oftentimes people don't listen to passive resistance. They're just seen as aloof or standoffish, right? But we're trying to redefine as a country who we are. And it goes back to what we were saying before. If you want to change the system, you have to, first you have to know that there's a system at play. And the system will do what it's always designed to do. And I think what's happening now with a lot of these protests is that these folks know a system will do what it's designed to do, but unless voices are heard to say, we are sick of saying people's names. And if you go back to that previous slide, and you don't have to go back to it, but where I talked about that the new Jim Crow is the criminal justice system. And so you have to start at the very beginning with how folks are brought into the criminal justice system, which is often disproportionately that burden is borne by people of color, Black and brown folks in particular. So I think that's what's happening. And I think if the system gets changed, we will move collectively into internalization, where there's a more equal future as a country, right? Where we're practicing cultural humility, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then I want to say another thing here. We're talking about race, but I think there's also some generational perspective here. You know, I have mentioned that I'm a Gen Xer, and you know, as we are talking about being called to action, it's also on Gen Xers to support and guide our millennials and Gen Z folks, largely, that are out there doing the protests, to then take this into our institutions where we now have some social and political capital and enact some of this movement towards redefinition in our respective organizations. So that's what I think is happening, is that we are in collective active resistance as a country, both people of color and white people alike.
Yeah, and perhaps that's the first time it's been, we've been in this state to this degree. I mean, you can really reflect a lot on this frame. So I'm glad you've shared that with us, and it gives a lot of food for thought, both as an individual, but you mentioned also the importance of, yeah, it's really the collective movement, and that will help us sort of shift forward. So.
And I want to mention here, you see down in the bottom right-hand corner, it says it's not linear, you move throughout. This was the trigger. Some people don't move. I could be in redefinition one day, and then something happens and I pop back to passive resistance or acceptance, depending upon where I am. So I think this last event, this series of last events with the 3 murders that occurred, that was the trigger point that moved people from wherever it was they were on this model into active resistance. So I think we need to remember that you could be all good one day, and then all of a sudden, and you may see this in your colleagues, that there's a whole different vibe, and it could be that something has triggered them to go into passive resistance, which is usually what it looks like in the workplace.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to do a little bit of a time check on where we're at. So we've got about 20 minutes left, and I want to for sure leave some space for good questions. But before we get to that, maybe you can just touch on a little bit, you know, what is the best way for us to recognize our own biases and privilege?
Yeah, I want to, and in the next slide, I want to introduce folks to this notion of cultural humility, because most of us are aware of the concept of cultural competence, which is, and I like to use the metaphor of a mirror, turning the mirror outward so that you're learning more about others, which is great, but you have to take that learning about others and turn the mirror inward and think about, how does that relate to my own perspectives, experiences, and interactions? So it allows culturally competent individuals, it presumes that there's a level of cultural competence to identify the presence and importance of differences. And if I don't say it once, I'll say it again. Please take color blindness out of your lexicon. You cannot practice cultural humility and move beyond our biases if we pretend that you and I look alike, Alison, because we do not. and our experiences are different because we are of two different racial and cultural backgrounds and a number of other identities that are hidden that you can't tell from looking at someone, right? So it's exploring those compromises so that you can realize the benefits of a diverse environment, because you're constantly, in the words of the great O'Shea Jackson, otherwise known as Ice Cube, checking yourself before you wreck yourself and others in any situation. So it's that lifelong process of checking yourself, checking your biases, checking your social circle. If on the weekends when you leave work, everybody that you hang out with looks like you, one of the things that we like to say is proximity breeds empathy. That is a one singular thing you could do, is ask yourself, why do all of my closest friends look like me? What's that about? And then just answering those questions for yourself, because you're constantly engaging in that lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique.
Yeah. Maybe we switch gears a little bit, because I think what's important is as we're listening and engaging in the conversation, that we also start to translate it a little bit to, how moving forward, how does activism in the workplace, what does that look like? And maybe you can give some insights from that perspective.
Sure. So there's a video we were going to show that you all are going to see, that we'll share with you in the slides, that does a really, really, really good job of explaining the difference between allyship and accomplishment, which doesn't mean that allyship doesn't have its place. Allyship is sort of the first stage on the continuum beyond actor, which is really just someone who talks a good game but doesn't do anything. That's essentially what an actor is. An ally is someone who really is starting to challenge institutional racism. They're like a disruptor, an educator in spaces. But an accomplice is really using their social and political capital and spending it and being willing to lose something, right? Much like some of the accomplices are that are out there protesting with people of color. And I'm going to read this, because this is the fundamental tenet of accomplishment. It's realizing that our freedoms and liberations are bound together. Retreat or withdrawal in the face of oppressive structures is not an option. Accomplices' actions are informed by, directed, and often coordinated with leaders who are Black, Brown, First Nations, Indigenous peoples, and/or people of color. And so when we talk about what that looks like in organizations, I like to talk about the 4 Ps. And those are policies, programs, practices, and people, right? Anytime you are trying to make any kind of institutional change, it's done through those Ps, looking at who's present, who's not, who has a voice, who doesn't, and figuring out in your respective spaces in your organization where you can do that. We have at UNT a 5-module series, very intensive, where we talk about a lot of these topics that we've spoken about today. But their homework, their capstone project, if you will, is what are some things somethings, right, within your respective spaces that you can make more intentionally inclusive and equitable, right? And we ask them to look at it through the lens of policies, programs, practices, and people. What often happens is when we also share with them the difference between a monocultural organization and a multicultural organization, they realize that they have to take maybe 5 steps back from where they thought the starting point would be, because, for example, this is a starting point. having dialogue is a starting point. Being aware of biases is a starting point. So I think it's being very realistic about what your starting point could be and what your something could be, particularly for Hilti through the lens of those policies, programs, practices, and people to begin to get to that institutional change. So for you, Alison, you know, what's something that you can think of within Hilti, within your sphere of influence? And I think that's what's really important, is that pick something that's within your immediate sphere of influence within an organization that you can make more intentionally inclusive or equitable.
Yeah, I like the framing of that. I would say, I mean, when I think about these 4 Ps even that you have showing here, I think we as an organization have done a really nice job on framing policies that represent our culture. So I think there we do, you know, maybe things aren't perfect and all things aren't captured, but I think that's an area that we're really strong in. From a program perspective, I feel like that's where my something comes to life. And, you know, obviously as the people leader of the organization, but also as an individual, I think that's the space that I have responsibility to play in. And so, you know, reflecting on this conversation in particular, there's lots of work to do on ensuring we see a more diverse makeup within our organization. And we've been on that journey with focus for sure. But I think my something is to really take a deeper look and dig deeper and really work on how do we, even from, if you take the whole life cycle of how we get people into our organization, from recruiting efforts that we do to have a strong representation of our community in the organization, all the way through to how we develop people, how we kind of sponsor people. I think there's a call to action for sure to have a more targeted effort on people of color within that whole framework. So that for me is my something.
Yeah, absolutely. So Shani, thank you for a really moving hour. You couldn't see in the background, but I was getting a constant feed of text to say, this is amazing, unbelievable. So what you brought us was what we needed in this moment, and thank you, and thank you, Alison. I think one of the things that impacted me the most was your diagram with the dotted line in the middle, and you have to decide to move over that line. Well, we have decided to move over that line as an organization, and so we need to work on cultural humility. We have done work on inclusion. We have a solid culture that can respond vibrantly to this challenge, and really now what we just need to do is increase the level of candor. And I like what you said, sometimes you have to risk a little social and political capital, right? Roll your hands up and roll your sleeves up and get dirty. And we know how to put on our boots and roll up our sleeves and get dirty at Hilti. And so that's what we're going to do now. So to the team, I've also been monitoring the chat and the questions. We're gonna continue this conversation. Some of these questions that you're asking are excellent, and we don't have answers yet, but you have my personal commitment and the commitment of the whole EMT that we're going to press on, and we're going to make some real change. So thank you for giving us your time today, Shani. Thank you for joining us, and everybody be safe, and we'll talk to you soon.